This is my spoiler-filled review of the 1988 remake of The Blob, directed by Chuck Russell of Dream Warriors fame and starring Shawnee Smith and Kevin Dillon. Now, I first watched this film back in the 90s and I didn't realise that it had Shawnee Smith in it. I mainly know her from the Saw series and the X-Files, so it was fascinating going back to this the other night and realising that she's in it and playing a teenage character. The story's quite basic in the film. A small meteorite lands in the woods next to this Californian town, and inside it is all this gloop that at first is not much bigger than this, but it starts to expand and get bigger. I think with every victim it devours, it has a growth spurt. I'm not sure how sentient it is, we're never really told, but clearly it has some intelligence because it can zero in on a victim in a room and make a dash for them, sort of thing. As to its long-term goals, no idea. We don't get to find out because at the end of this film, it does get destroyed when it's about the size of a house, I'd say. But I would have been fascinated to see a sequel to this where the Blob succeeds in taking over the world, a bit like Skynet in Terminator, and just, you know, all the way across America, just strands of the Blob everywhere you go, and resistance groups would spring up where they try and fight back. But that would need a much bigger budget than even this first film, and even the first film didn't succeed with the budget it had. It was a box office bomb. It did review very well. I think it got 62% on Rotten Tomatoes, but yeah, not even during the remake craze did anybody go back and touch this after its performance in 1988. So my dreams of seeing The Blob 2 World Domination will probably never come to fruition. I did check out some clips of the 1950s version of this on YouTube just before doing this review. I've never actually seen that film with Steve Mcqueen, and it looks better than I imagined it to be. I thought it would be black and white and terrible, but it seems like it might be watchable. I'm not sure if I'll ever get round to giving it a chance, but that's not to say that the effects in the 88 version are perfect. I mean, they're good for the most part, but there are still scenes where you can tell that the Blob is not in the same room as the things it's meant to be in the same room as, if you see what I mean. But I think all that stuff just adds to its charm. There are a number of gruesome deaths. There's a homeless guy who gets melted from the waist down. There's this blonde woman who dies in a phone booth, and she was such a nice character up to that point as well. But the death that I always remember from watching this growing up is that of Paul at the medical clinic. The Blob sort of covers his face, but you can still see his expression behind it, and he's going, ah, like that. And my memory of the film is that he was set up to be the main character, and then the film pulls the rug out from under you and says, actually it's not him, it's Kevin Dillon as Brian. But I have to concede, rewatching this the other night, that actually Brian and Paul get an equal amount of screen time in the lead up to Paul's death. So my memory didn't really stand up on that point. But though, if I was watching the film for the first time now, then before Paul's death at least, I would presume probably that Paul, Brian and Meg would spend the majority of this film together, having a dynamic similar to those characters from the early Star Wars films. But Paul exits stage right, and we're left with Brian and Meg, and it's fun to watch their budding relationship because they've never really spoken before at high school, it's said, and so now they get this friendship, and maybe it'll turn into something more, although they don't kiss at the end of the film, which is slightly disappointing. They just do this pathetic little hug. I mean, personally, I always kiss a girl just after I've helped her destroy a blob, but that's just me. The character of Brian, though, is really good. He's got a motorcycle jacket and motorbike. He's cool as hell, even though he's not liked by half the town. It's a very easy character to get behind, and I like the performance by Kevin Dillon. I did look at his Wikipedia the other night to see what other films he's done. I don't think he's done anything that I've seen personally, but he really is good as this character, Brian. One of the film's most notable scenes takes place in a cinema. The Blob barges its way in and everybody panics and starts running for the exits. And I feel like this should have been the film's big Carnage Candy moment where, you know, the Blob absorbs about 20 people at the same time and you can see them all fighting behind the glue like that. But I just don't think they had the CGI wizardry to pull it off. So what we ultimately get is just a CGI shot of the Blob, you know, on top of all the seats, and tentacles are moving around, but nobody's really dying. Not that I could tell. I'm not sure if anybody dies on that cinema floor, unless I just missed it. A couple of people die up in the projectioners booth, which was a good scene. It's exciting when Meg turns up and starts fighting against the tide because she needs to get into the cinema to rescue these two boys. And there's a cool effect with flashing lights as she's trying to get to them. I like what everybody was watching on the screen before the Blob turns up, a film called The Garden Tools Massacre. I love it when films make up films within their film that are just really silly like that. I remember watching the Deadpool with Clint Eastwood in it with my aunt, and that they had a movie within a movie. It was called Night of the Slasher, and we had a good laugh at that. And I'm just thinking to myself, I would love to see that film in real life. Same with Garden Tools Massacre. Now, I'm not sure if it's before the cinema scene or after it, but a shady government agency turns up, and this adds an interesting wrinkle to the story, because it's sort of implied that these guys must have known about the existence of these meteorites with the blob substance in. Otherwise, how could they have got to the town so quickly to deal with the situation? So it's fascinating to think, has there been a meteorite before this film and somewhere else, and the government managed to contain it, and maybe they've now got another blob locked away somewhere in a cage in Area 51? Well, it can't be a cage, can it? Or it just slither its way through the bars. Maybe like an enclosed, locked room or something like that. Even though there was no sequel, they did at least have an open ending just in case they wanted to make one, which is sort of odd, because if you're going to make a sequel to The Blob, surely you could just have another meteorite come down and that's how you get started again. But what happens is, halfway through the movie, a priest character finds this little bit of blob and he puts it into a container, and that's the last we think about it for a long, long time. And then at the end, just after the main blob has been destroyed, we cut back to this priest after he's finished a sermon, and he's looking into this container and he says something like, the Lord will give me a sign. I'm like, what? So what? He's thinking that one day God's suddenly going to whisper into his ear, I continue to be disappointed by my sons and daughters on earth. You know what? Release the blob. Yeah, that's a pretty grim thought, but I like to think that because there is no Blob 2, the priest never received that little word in his ear, and right now, in the present day, that container is just sat safely in a broom cupboard somewhere where it will never be found. Another thing I wanted to mention is that there's an actor called Paul McCrane in this film. He plays the most antagonistic of the cops. He's a real pain in the arse to Brian in the first half of the film, although he gets a little bit more likeable as the movie goes on. Now, this actor, the year before this came out, was in a film called RoboCop, famous film. He played one of the villains, a character called Emil, a little ginger guy. You probably remember him if you've seen that film. At the end, he gets killed at this like sewage plant place where he basically gets melted by toxic chemicals. You see him come out into this road going, because he's melting. And then this car hits him and bits of him fly all over the place. In this film, he gets melted by the blob. So it's kind of weird that 2 films running, he's been melted by toxic chemicals and now he's been melted by the blob. Paul McCrane must surely mention this at dinner parties and stuff, because how many other actors can say they've had 2 consecutive endings like that? In terms of negatives, I would only really mention the ending, which is a little bit abrupt for my tastes. It's not a short film, this. It's 96 minutes, which is hefty enough for a horror film, but I just think this is a movie which could have done with the whole one last scare scenario where maybe a little bit of the blob could have broken off and chased Meg and Brian down an alley for, one last little mini battle in a dark cellar somewhere or something like that. This is my Blu-ray copy of the film, which I got quite recently. A very pink cover, good cover. It's not got much in the way of special features. I'd have loved to have seen a commentary track with Kevin Dillon and Shawnee Smith talking about their experiences of the film together, but you can't have everything. Funnily enough, the film I reviewed before this, The Burning, the Blu-ray for that had 3 commentary tracks on it, which is a little bit excessive. I'll never watch more than 1 of the 3 if there are that many on a Blu-ray disc. I'll just pick out the one that sounds the best and go with that. Because if you have 3, invariably, the worst sounding one is always something like commentary track by the assistant key grip and the costume designer. And I think, well, you're not going to go that deep into a film, are you, surely? Right, let's get to the bag of terror and wrap this one up. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 3.5 bloody axes for The Blob. Just recently I did a video where I listed my top 100 horror films of all time, and The Blob came roughly 68th, I think. So this is a film that I really like. It was part of my childhood and it's been a real delight to go back to it and do a review for it. Right, I'll be back again with a review for something else. Until next time, see you, bye-bye.